tarde.
Good afternoon.
Desde abril, estamos aqui juntos discutindo aspectos do norte do Paraná.
Since April, we are here together discussing aspects of the Northern Paraná,
Homenageando Ethel Kosminsky, que pesquisou Rolândia, apontando o estabelecimento de refugiados de guerra, particularmente os judeus, quando a cidade se inventava como uma cidade alemã.
paying homage to Ethel Kosminsky, who researched Hollandia, pointing out the settlement of war refugees, particularly Jews, when that town was inventing itself as a German city.
Os encontros envolveram historiadores, geógrafos, assistentes sociais, sociólogos e arquitetos brasileiros e estrangeiros.
The meetings involved Brazilian and foreigner historians, geographers, social workers, sociologists, and architects, many of them still in training.
Que apresentaram suas discussões sobre bairros e logradouros de Londrina, um culto local às relíquias de mártires romanos em Tomazina, pequenas comunidades da região metropolitana de Londrina e suas relações com a globalização, o cemitério São Rafael em Rolândia, os remanescentes da Estrada Mestra da Companhia de Terras em Cambé, os cultos afro-brasileiros em Ibiporã, a população Hunsrück em São Martinho.
Those professionals who presented their discussions about neighborhoods and squares in Londrina, we also had lessons about a local cult to the relics of Roman martyrs in Tomazina, small communities of the metropolitan region of Londrina and their relations with globalization, the cemetery of Saint Raphael in Rolândia, the remnants of the master road of the land company in Cambé. We had also Afro-Brazilian cults in Ibiporã and the Hunsrück population in São Martinho.
A abertura e agora o encerramento foram e são especiais.
The opening of these lectures, those from the past and those from the present, were also special.
Daniel Steidle apresentou a vivificação da memória, criando ações de preservação e lutando por políticas da memória e de proteção ao patrimônio.
Daniel Steidle presented the vivification of memory, creating preservation actions, fighting for memory and heritage protection policies.
Hoje, Ina Kerner abordará essas mesmas questões sob o viés de uma estudiosa das questões decoloniais.
Today, Ina Kerner will address these same questions from the perspective of a decolonial scholar.
Fazenda Bimini e Universidade de Koblenz se encontram novamente, estabelecendo uma praxis que nós, aqui do NDPH, também reivindicamos.
Bimini Farm and the University of Koblenz meet again, establishing a practice that we are demanding here no NDPH.
Paralela às palestras, pintores, escultores, fotógrafos da região metropolitana e da cidade de Koblenz apresentaram mostras.
Parallel to the lectures, painters, sculptors, and photographers from the metropolitan area and the city of Koblenz presented exhibitions.
Olhares específicos que somente a arte é capaz de estabelecer.
Specific perspectives that only art is capable of establishing.
Aproveitamos e convidamos a todos para prestigiar a exposição de Lisa Emrich, fotógrafa e aluna da Universidade de Koblenz, intitulada A Construção do Olhar, que se encontra na plataforma Behance.
We would like to take this opportunity to invite you to see the exhibition by Lisa Emrich, photographer and student of the University of Koblenz, entitled The Construction of the Gaze, which can be found on the Behance platform.
Gostaria de agradecer aos funcionários e estagiários do NDPH. a Pró-Reitoria de Extensão da UEL e as nossas tradutoras, Júlia Fittipaldi, Mariana Ferreira e hoje, excepcionalmente, Estênio Caio.
I would like to thank the staff and interns of the NDPH, the Pró-Reitoria of Extension of the UEL, and our translators, Mariana and Júlia.
Passo agora a palavra para a doutora Ina Kerner, que abordará as questões que envolvem a política ou as políticas da memória e do patrimônio.
I would like now to finally introduce you to Ina Kerner, who will address the issues involving the politics of memory and heritage.
A professora Kerner atua na Universidade de Koblenz-Landau, desenvolvendo pesquisas sobre decolonização, culturas periféricas, políticas da memória e estudos de gênero.
Professor Kerner works at Koblenz-Landau University, developing research on decolonization, peripheral cultures, and memory politics.
Ela vive a saga de Untitled contemporâneo, prestigiando o Teatro Gorki ou ministrando cursos e desenvolvendo atividades na Alemanha, na América Latina, no Paquistão. Hoje, doutora Ina Kerner nos fala de Oñate, do País Basco.
She lives her own saga as a contemporary Wilhelm Meister, given her prestige at the Gorki Theater as a doctor who teaches courses and developing activities in Germany, Latin America, and Pakistan. But today she talks about the Basque country. Ina, it is yours the word now.
Hello, everybody. I greet you from the International Institute for the Sociology of Law in Oñate, in the Spanish part of the Basque Country. I am a fellow at this institute for a few weeks, something that I'm really happy about, but even happier at the moment I am that I can be with you and record a video that will be shown in the lecture series Ethel Kosminsky in a few days. So first of all, muito obrigada for the invitation to present in this wonderful lecture series. It's both a great honor and a pleasure to be here, despite this being an online and not an offline event. My task for today is to present and discuss some of the theoretical debates that may help us understand and unravel some of the complexities of Rolandia's history and of our ways of relating to this history. I should say right away that I will speak from a critical German perspective, by which I mean two things. First, a perspective that is particularly interested in the German Rolandia, in the town's legacy of being a German colony of the 1930s and a refuge for German and other European Jews who had to flee from the Nazis. And second, that the theoretical positions and debates that I will present are predominantly German ones. I'm well aware of the limitations of this perspective. Rolandia has more legacies than its German one, and I assume that there are many more theoretical positions and debates that we could draw on to understand and discuss this case. Maybe later in the discussion, others can contribute further perspectives and we can bring several of them into dialogue. But first, allow me to say what I want to do in the next half hour. My presentation will have 3 parts. First, mostly with reference to cultures and politics of remembrance in Germany, I will discuss 2 different modes of such remembrance, namely a retributive and a reconciliatory one. And I will do so with regard to remembrance of German colonialism, National Socialism, and the GDR past. Second, I will introduce positions and debates that depart from juxtaposing and comparing different histories and memories, but instead stress connections and entanglements. And third, I will relate some of the ideas I presented earlier to the case of Hollandia and pose a few questions for our discussion. As a caveat, I need to add that what I present is rather preliminary, which is why already now I'm really looking forward to your reactions and to our discussions after my presentation. I come to the first part, retributive versus reconciliatory modes of remembrance. In an essay published in 2013, Jakob Emanuel Marbe, a political theorist from Cameroon, who in the course of the last decades has taught at several German universities, discusses and partly problematizes the way in which German public discourse deals with a country's colonial past on the African continent. Marbe starts off his considerations by distinguishing 2 groups of actors that shape the current constellations, and he makes it quite clear that he sympathizes with the second group. The first group, and you can find it on the slide, is history patriots, actors who espouse traditional notions of European civilization and German nationalism, and downplay the atrocities of German colonialism by portraying the latter as part of Europe's supposed civilizing mission. Failures of this mission are attributed to the colonized themselves, and neither to the colonizers nor to the concept and the practices of colonization. So in a way, this is a case of blaming the victim. A view of colonialism that highlights the latter's intrinsically uncivil elements is foreign to the history patriots. The second group, history humanists, are actors who denounce Germany's prominent role in European colonialism instead of whitewashing or downplaying it. Furthermore, history humanists are engaged in conducting and supporting critical studies on German colonialism, and in this sense have laid the ground for what we may call colonial Aufarbeitung, a broader critical public debate on our colonial history, its long-term effects, and the responsibilities that may arise from it. I would not claim that in Germany such a debate is sufficiently strong by now, but thankfully, due to history humanists as well as to the work of political activism in the field, including street-level activism like the demonstrations organized by Black Lives Matter, it seems well underway. On a more conceptual level, I would claim that Marbe's distinction and characterization of history patriots versus history humanists shows the high extent to which cultures and politics of remembrance are politicized. It furthermore suggests that scholarship in this field can never escape this politicization, nor, I would add, should it aspire to do so. There is a second aspect in Marbe's essay that I find particularly noteworthy and thought-provoking. It refers to different logics or regimes that a particular state and society may apply when engaging in memory politics, on the domestic level as well as abroad. Marbe addresses Germany's support of truth and reconciliation initiatives abroad in contrast to the very different, namely retributive, way Germany deals with its own past, when he writes, From an African perspective, it is difficult to understand the politics of remembrance in Germany and to deduct a common perspective of reconciliation from it. Let me just move this somewhere so you can see it. It is clear that criminals have to be rightfully punished, but when persons and victims decide for conciliation, they have to accept the consequences this decision implies for their moral, political, economic, and religious action, and stop abusing one another. Unlike hardly any other nation, the Germans are engaged in a peaceful togetherness in South Africa and emphatically, as well as rightfully, plea for nearly unconditional reconciliation. But the fact that in Germany, former National Socialists as well as SED functionaries are persecuted not only by law, but also politically in a way that comes close to exclusion, severely contradicts the German pledge for forgiveness and reconciliation in other countries. What Mabe denounces here is a double standard in Germany's politics of remembrance at home and abroad, and it may come as no surprise that his suggestion is for Germany to adopt a more reconciliatory than retributive regime regarding its own affairs as well. To him, a successful reconciliatory regime explicitly stresses the effective dimension that is involved when we try to progress from remembrance to forgiveness to reconciliation, which according to him is the path to follow. Focusing on what he calls African, oral tradition-based ways of dealing with European colonialism, he emphasizes the importance of activities that facilitate healing rather than comprehensive, detailed knowledge about the motives of colonization. His examples for such activities include dancing, singing, speaking, praying, mourning, and eating. And indeed, the way in which Germany deals with former National Socialist Party members and state bureaucrats, as well as with GDR functionaries, points in a very different direction. I shall mention that in Germany, the GDR is officially categorized as a dictatorship, which in a way puts it in the same category as Nazi rule. I find this quite problematic, given that Nazi rule was institutionalized racism to the degree of genocide, which was clearly not the case in the GDR. But that aside, since unification, people who worked for Stasi, the GDR Ministry for State Security, are practically exempt from public service, which includes jobs in schools, universities, the police, and the public administration. Victims of the GDR state can claim for compensation, and in 1998, the Public Foundation for the Study of Communist Dictatorship in East Europe, which is the official title in English of Bundesstiftung zur Aufarbeitung der SED-Diktatur, was founded, an institution that promotes scholarship, public events, and publications that deal with the GDR past in a critical way. To date, there is no comparable foundation dealing with the country's colonial past, nor are there schemes for individual compensation or collective reparations. I would claim that this points to a second double standard in German memory politics, in this case, a double standard that deeply roots in history patriotism and in continuing forms of colonial racism. For in its heyday around 1900, Germany was a metropole of one of the largest European empires. Let me show you. The blue places on this map are former German colonies, which this empire, so because this empire comprised what is now Namibia, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Togo, parts of Ghana, and Cameroon, as well as Tsingtao in China, parts of what is now Papua New Guinea, and several smaller Pacific islands. The colonial wars in China and in former German Southwest and Southeast Africa led to tens of thousands of deaths. The treatment of the Nama and Herero people by the German army in the course and in the aftermath of the 1904 to 1908 colonial war in today's Namibia is by now officially, which means by the government, recognized as an act of genocide. But apparently, and sadly so, to our state and society, the lives that were taken in the course of these atrocities seem less valuable and hence less grievable than European lives. At least, and also I would say less memorable in that sense of politics of memory. After all, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, is a central concept of Germany's politics of remembrance. So far, it mostly excludes our colonial past. But allow me to say a bit more about this context, this concept. If we follow political theorist Helmut König, German Vergangenheitsbewältigung comprises 5 elements. The first 4 of these elements clearly point to the retributive German remembrance regime that I have mentioned before. These aspects are first, the ban of incriminate organizations like parties. Second, the legal punishment of perpetrators, like in the case of the Nuremberg trials. Third, the disqualification of incriminated persons, which is what Mabe problematizes as acts of exclusion. Like in the case of Carl Schmitt, who denied reinstatement as a professor after World War II. Fourth, the rehabilitation and compensation of the victims. And fifth, a coming to terms with the past in the public sphere in the form of commemoration days, museums, memorials, exhibits, and other places of memory. König does stress that some of these elements were for the most part enacted by the Allied forces and later taken back, like in the case of the amnesty laws introduced by Konrad Adenauer in 1949, which partly stopped and partly even redid denazification measures that had been undertaken in the 4 years before. But we can probably state that in a general sense, this combination of elements can still be seen as hegemonic regarding the Nazi past and in a way also regarding the GDR past. Against this backdrop, I want to point to 2 additional insights that König points us to. The first of these is a tension between elements 1 to 5 on the one hand and the 5th element on the other hand. In other words, between the retributive elements and public discourse. König claims, I quote him, in a situation in which there is a threat of legal consequences or professional disqualification, it is quite clear that public discourse is dominated by strategic considerations of self-protection accusation instead of by an orientation towards truth, information, and understanding. End of quote. To König, this is the reason why in Latin American and South African truth and reconciliation initiatives, the retributive aspect has been missing, and why in the aftermath of the GDR, a critical public discourse on this part of German history never flourished. If König is right with his claim, in other words, if it is unlikely that we can ever have retribution and a public discourse fit to fostering reconciliation at the same time, the question arises which of these 2 options one should prefer and whether there are other solutions. In Germany, where to my knowledge concerning the GDR, these alternatives have never been seriously discussed, the direction into which future colonial remembrance may develop remains an open question. So far, however, retribution seems out of sight, not only because the perpetrators don't live anymore, but also since the German government decidedly rejects any claim to reparations. Instead, it has chosen the path of apologizing and of asking for forgiveness, partly employing Christian vocabulary. And I should say it's good that it did this. It has not wanted to do so for a long time. In May of 2021, so in May of this year, the German government has furthermore offered the sum of 1.1 billion euros for what is called reconstruction and development during the next 30 years. It must be said that already now the German development organization GIZ administers projects that in total amount to the sum of over 134 million euros. The sum offered in May will complement this work, but it is to go into development projects as well. The focus will be on, or is supposed to be, on land reform, including land acquisition and development, agriculture, rural infrastructure, water supply, and vocational training. And I said it is supposed to be because at this moment, the parliament in Namibia still has to accept Germany's offer, but there are debates about whether they should or whether they shouldn't. So I would argue that the double standard of German memory politics that Marbe has identified may play out with regard to the country's colonial remembrance as well. Is it possible that there is an implicit understanding that at the domestic level, and hence for ethnic Germans themselves, retribution and restitution seem to be the right strategy, while for others, and to be blunt, former colonial and for the most part non-white others, forgiving and reconciliation is recommended, coupled with development aid, which comes with its own imperial baggage? If this was the case, this should probably be interpreted as an after or rather a long-time effect of colonial racism itself, and hence as part of the problem. We would then be dealing with a situation in which racism, this particularly pernicious element of our colonial past, informs the way in which today we try to come to terms with this same past. We would be dealing with a situation in which the problem informs the finding of solutions. And I guess it is self-understood that this is not good. Come to the second insight of König that I want to speak about. And this one leads into a slightly different direction, even though I fear it does not really contradict the thought experiment I have just put forth. König stresses, and other authors engaged in this debate, like for instance, prominent cultural studies scholar Aleida Assmann, second this point, that what is peculiar about Germany's Vergangenheitsbewältigung, for the most part, a politics of Nazi and Holocaust remembrance, is what he calls a denationalization of memory. The culture and politics of German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, he claims, is not dedicated to the country's own victims, but to the victims of the other side, including particularly those whose death Germany itself has been responsible for. I would claim that the reconciliation effect of this strategy with regard to the relation between non-Jewish Germans and Jews can be assessed as a great success, even if this unfortunately does not mean that anti-Semitism was abolished in Germany. In fact, it is on the rise again. But still, there is a notion that I would say shows that it more or less worked, which is a notion that Angela Merkel and other conservative politicians like to use, and it is the expression of our Jewish Christian tradition, and this expression of our Jewish Christian tradition has actually become liberal common sense in Germany. So we can say that very fortunately, Jews are welcome in Germany and are being seen as part of the country in an almost natural way, which of course has not always been the case in the liberal kind of discourse, not by right-wingers who are there as well and to think differently. The fact that in the last years, this tradition of a Jewish Christian sort of West has been played out against Muslims is another story, and one that must be critically discussed. Nevertheless, I would claim that efforts to denationalize remembrance have to a certain extent worked, even though we may want to problematize König's label insofar as many of those who lost their lives in the Holocaust were indeed Germans too, just not the kind of Germans the Nazis themselves reserved this label for. if we speak of denationalizing remembrance, when we have the German remembrance of Jewish victims in mind, we reproduce the exclusion of Germans from the imagined community of Germans, which reproduces part of the problem in the process of naming our solution, at least concerning German Jews. I, of course, know that very many Jewish people from other countries were murdered during the Nazi regime as well. And in that respect, then, the denationalization would be an adequate term, in my opinion. I would like to add that so far, this solution for the most part works regarding the victim group of the Jews. Still, you don't hear anyone speak of a German Roma tradition, for instance, even though Roma people were among those being exempt from the status of Aryans and systematically murdered in concentration camps as well. To me, this raises the question of the scope and of the limits of practices of denationalizing remembrance, of remembering and acknowledging the suffering of others. Does it potentially include all others? And if not, whom does it exempt and on which grounds, according to which explicit or implicit criteria? Maybe we can speak about this later in the discussion. I come to the next part, entangled histories and interconnected memories. And let me move this a bit. What I have presented so far may create the impression that it makes sense to discuss different cultures and politics of remembrance separately from each other, or comparatively at best. In what follows, I want to contest this impression, and I will do so in 3 steps with recourse to 3 different texts or debates. And I start with the first, German education scholar Astrid Messerschmitt. She has written about how post-colonial cultures and politics of remembrance may look like in a post-Nazi society. And it may come as no surprise that the focus she chooses is on how to deal with racism and anti-Semitism, 2 twin systems of belief that are intricately linked with German colonialism and National Socialism, since both regimes must be seen as extreme forms of institutionalized state racism, which produced and used racist and anti-Semitic claims to justify their hierarchizing, excluding, exploitational, and murderous politics. As we all know, both anti-Semitism and racist colonial imaginations preceded the German colonial and Nazi periods and lived on after their formal end. Nevertheless, Messerschmitt rightly asks in which exact ways they live on and in which ways they should be seen and interpreted as entangled. In this respect, she presents us with a number of observations, of which I will address 2, and you find them on the slide. First, she problematizes that what I've just interpreted as a success of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, namely the fact that in Germany, a critical reworking of the Nazi past can by now be considered as a liberal mainstream position, is being used to suggest that we have overcome all forms of racism, including colonial forms. According to Messerschmitt, and I fear there is ample empirical evidence to follow her in this respect, this is not the case. We have not overcome racism. Second, Messerschmitt problematizes what is called secondary anti-Semitism, namely current forms of anti-Semitism that do one of 3 things. They either relativize the Holocaust directly, or they highlight Jewish involvement in European colonialism, including settler colonialism in Israel and Palestine, and against this backdrop, relativize the Holocaust by way of a victim-perpetrator reversal, or they criticize the Jews for supposedly profiting from a permanent referral to Auschwitz. Messerschmitt problematizes these forms of secondary anti-Semitism, but she also stresses the fact that often anti-Semitism is being othered to or externalized by attributing an anti-Semitic position to Muslim migrants. And to her, such complex acts of relativizing, of downplaying or externalizing Either colonial and anti-Muslim racism or anti-Semitism are the permanent danger of cultures and politics of remembrance in the post-colonial and post-Holocaust context of Germany. This constellation, as well as some of the examples she provides us with, indeed show that and how references to both of these decidedly dark stages and aftermaths of German history intersect. Against this backdrop, Messerschmitt concludes that we should never forget the existence of these intersections and try to prevent any form of relativization. This task could be achieved by systematically embracing a, quote, double perspective that focuses on and distinguishes the afterlife of both colonial and National Socialist worldviews and self-images, end of quote. This brings me to the second step of this section, which is a historical, or rather historiographical debate, the ongoing debate on the exact nature of the relation of German colonialism on the one hand and Nazi politics on the other hand. By now it is well known that the first German concentration camps were built and run in what now is Namibia, namely towards the end of the war between the German colonial army and the Nama and Terero people, which took place from 1904 to 1908. But does that mean that there is a direct line, a historical continuity that connects the colonial concentration camps with the ones that the Nazis built and ran? Two prominent German historians are mostly being presented and quoted as the main antagonists in this debate, which, by the way, is exploding just right now. This debate is due to a few new publications, partly by Dirk Moses, but also by other people. So the debate is exploding at this particular moment. The newspapers are full of it, but concerning the historiographical part, still, Jürgen Zimmerer and Birte Kundrus are I consider as very prominent, and Zimmerer is very much in this actual current debate as well. So Jürgen Zimmerer, a global history scholar who, among other things, is well known for his work on colonial legacies and remains in Germany itself, is the one person I want to present. And then Birte Kundrus, who has gained prominence with a study on the cultural history of German colonialism, but who also focuses her work on National Socialism. Zimmerer claims continuities, or rather parallels, between German colonialism and Nazi rule. Interestingly, to him, these parallels don't so much consist in the fact that within only 40 years, both in the course of German colonialism, particularly in what today is Namibia, and National Socialism, German soldiers and bureaucrats committed a genocide and created a racial state. To him, the parallel mostly consists in the settler colonial aspects of both regimes. It lies in the way in which both in Deutsch Südwest Africa, Germany's settler colony in what today is Namibia, and in Eastern Europe under Hitler, namely in the course of what was called Lebensraumpolitik or habitat policy, the local population was degraded. It was reduced to the status of a working class in the service of a white and Aryan ruling class, with the task of developing both territories and of leading them into prosperity. Kundrus, on the other hand, rather highlights the differences between both constellations. She claims that the colonial war in today's Namibia, the Nazi habitat policy, and the Holocaust followed their own independent trajectories and should therefore be studied each in their own right. But despite this position, Kundrus engages in considering links and entanglements between German colonialism and National Socialism, and hence contributes to a debate that assumes a relation between both regimes instead of playing one out against the other. Assuming such relations is the explicit aim of Michael Rothberg, the third position I want to present in this section. He has put his position forth in his 2009 book, Multi-Directional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, which has come to be influential both in memory studies and in the intersection of post-colonial and Jewish studies. In this book, Rothberg argues against competitive constellations among different strands of remembrance in favor of what he calls multi-directional memory. He declares, and I quote, and you'll find the quote on the slide, against the framework that understands collective memory as competitive memory, as a zero-sum struggle over scarce resources, I suggest that we consider memory as multi-directional, as subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, as productive and not privative. End of quote. Memory to him is the past made present. When he argues against competitive memory, he problematizes what in the realm of identity politics has been critically called oppression Olympics, and he does so with cases in mind in which memory and identity are more or less taken as synonyms, and in which marginalized groups struggle for public recognition by problematizing the public remembrance of the suffering of other groups. I reject two central assumptions, Rothberg declares in this respect, and I quote him again, that a straight line runs from memory to identity, and that the only kind of memories and identities that are therefore possible are the ones that exclude elements of alterity and forms of commonality with others. End of quote. Going beyond memory competitions, which for the most part he describes as competitions between marginalized groups, in favor of embracing multi-directional memories, to Rothberg comes with the potential of new political solidarities and more complex visions of achieving justice. The reason for why Rothberg argues in such a way in the first place is the dominant role that he attributes to cultures and politics of Holocaust remembrance vis-à-vis the public memory of other atrocities like colonial ones. For the context of the US, he says that Holocaust remembrance sometimes becomes what drawing on Freud he calls screen memory, Deckerinnerung, a screen that allows to disengage with other traumatic events, usually ones closer to home. We all know that the Holocaust was something that the Germans committed and the US were fighting against it, but the history of the US is not a all humanistic one at all, neither. It is a former settler colony which has worked with acts of dispossession, of slavery, and of other things that could sort of make a more critical, maybe, that could be the subject of a critical working through the darker sides of the US history as well, at least potentially. Regarding the case of Germany, we know about a similar dynamic similar to screen memory from Messerschmitt, who states that German Vergangenheitsbewältigung sometimes is used to screen off the existence of racism in the country. And since this is a lecture which is going to go to Londrina in Brazil, it would be interesting to learn whether you would think that in the Brazilian case, similar forms of screen memory are working. I come to the last part, multi-directional Rolandia. When looking at Rolandia, Rothberg's concept of multi-directional memory seems to find its natural place or natural example. For in fact, the town's history is implied in a multitude of global, regional, as well as local processes, rationalities, activities, and atrocities, which in the town's history, as well as in narrative of this history, crystallize and intersect. This starts with the colonial origins of the town. Brazil is a former settler colony, and northern Paraná was in the 1930s developed by the private Companhia de Terras Norte do Paraná, CNTP, sorry for my German pronunciation, which was a subsidiary of the British Paraná Plantations Company, which was a joint stock company based in London that grew out of another company named Brazil Plantation Syndicate, a subsidiary of British Sudan Plantation Syndicate, which was a firm dedicated to cotton production in what was British colony of Sudan. The foundation and building up of Rolanda was a collaborative effort of CNTP and the German Gesellschaft für wirtschaftliche Studien in Übersee, an association that organized German settlement abroad. The first settlers for Rolanda had been recruited by a German colonial organization, later mostly Jewish refugees fleeing from Nazi Germany, as well as the offspring of German immigrants who had initially settled in more southern regions of Brazil, found their way to Rolanda. The Kaingang people who had lived in the region before CNTP started its activities there were dispossessed and resettled in reservations. So already when looking at core historical data of the town itself, you find entanglements of Portuguese settler colonialism, including the dispossession of the indigenous population, which is a typical feature of European settler colonialism, of British colonialism in the form of CNTP, and of German colonialism, the latter even more than a decade after its formal end. Furthermore, we find Nazi anti-Semitism and dictatorship and the Holocaust in the form of people who came to Rolanda fleeing from it. We find the aftermath of German poverty emigration in the form of the Hunsrück people who found their way to Rolanda from further south in Brazil. Among the early German settlers of the town, there were political frictions between German nationalists and Nazi opponents, as well as striking class differences. When we look at the local politics and cultures of Rolanda memory, we also find all sorts of silences, struggle, and debate. Put this here. There is debate about the importance and the role of Oswald Nixdorf for the town's development. Struggle over the representation of the history and dispossession of the Kaingang people put forth by the Kaingang themselves, buttressed by a number of support institutions and played out in very different arenas. In the Londrina History Museum as a quasi-natural site of public remembrance, but also in the Kaingang struggle for land rights. Here, Rothberg's insight that in settler colonial context, I quote, conflicts over memory converge with contests over territory, end of quote, seems to fit all too well. And then there's the open question, which subgroup of Rolanda Germans is it that stands for the continued Germanness of the place, if we want to speak of it at all? Was Rolanda predominantly a Jewish settlement, like for instance the documentary film Flucht in den Dschungel suggests? Or was it a German colony in the tradition of earlier and more formal forms of German settler colonialism or other forms of colonialism, like Oswald Nixdorf suggests in his memoir Pionier im brasilianischen Urwald? Or was it both? And what about those and the descendants of those who were less formally educated and less at home in bourgeois practices like memoir writing, and hence have so far not contributed to the pile of Rolanda books that to date have been published, namely the Hunsrück people? How important are they, despite the fact that so far their role in Rolanda remembrance culture has been rather marginalized, because the books, the memoirs that have been written, have not been written by them, but by members of the two other groups. These are some of the data, the lines of connections, and the questions that come to mind when looking at multi-directional Rolanda. At least they come to my mind, and with more time, I think that would be worthwhile to push and discuss much further. Maybe there are many more lines and more questions, and I'm looking forward to learning about them and to our discussion now. Thank you so much for your attention, and muito obrigada.
Boa tarde, nós vamos dar início agora ao bloco das perguntas. Eu gostaria de informar a vocês, a quem está nos acompanhando, de que a nossa homenageada pelo Ciclo, Ethel Kosminsky, está presente, veio prestigiar o encerramento do nosso evento com a palestra da Kerner. Eu vou começar a fazer as perguntas, começar com a pergunta do Will. Ina, você trabalha com as questões acerca do colonialismo alemão. Ao visitar e conhecer melhor a Rolândia durante o Summer School de 2019, você consegue perceber elementos colonialistas presentes na formação de Rolândia? Se sim, quais chamam mais sua atenção?
So, Ina, as you said, you work with questions about German colonialism. When visiting and better knowing Hollandia during the 2019 summer school, could you notice any colonialism elements present in Hollandia's formation? And if so, which ones caught your attention?
Thank you very much for this question. It's not so easy to answer because one would have to think about what Hollandia's formation is. But I would say, of course, what came to what was very apparent to me was infrastructural elements like buildings with German architecture, the cemetery with German graves. And then, of course, there are lots of people who speak German as their first or second sort of first language. So I would say these were the things that were most visible to me when I went there first.
A Ina agradece a pergunta. Ela diz que não é muito fácil pensar sobre isso, porque é necessário pensar sobre a origem da cidade de Rolândia, mas o que chamou mais a atenção dela foi a questão da infraestrutura da cidade, a infraestrutura, a arquitetura alemã, os túmulos do cemitério de Rolândia e, claro, as pessoas que têm o alemão como primeira ou como segunda língua lá em Rolândia. Foi isso que chamou mais a atenção dela.
A próxima pergunta é da Leila. Ina, quando a Alemanha se abre, nos dias de hoje, por meio de sua primeira-ministra, aos migrantes, você acha que a memória citada por Mabi é de alguma forma lembrada?
So this question comes from Leila.
Maybe, yeah.
And she asks, when Germany opened its gates to immigrants nowadays through their first minister, don't you think that Mabe's studies of memory is somehow remembered?
Can you explain? Can you repeat the second half of the question? Which memory is remembered?
Mabe's.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I haven't really studied it, so I can just guess. My guess would be that maybe Angela Merkel, who is from a conservative party, which usually is not for open borders, with her GDR past and a past of a country which not everybody, of course, but several people wanted to leave, in a way might have had a different stance concerning issues of migration, and particularly a situation in which you need or think you need to leave a country than other party members, particularly West German party members of her party. And then I have something else to say, but maybe you can translate first.
Yeah. A Ina disse que é uma pergunta interessante. Ela não estudou isso, então ela só pode adivinhar. E o que ela adivinha é que a Angela Merkel nunca foi muito pela abertura das fronteiras, mas que pode haver uma divergência aí entre o Partido Conservador da Angela Merkel e a política de recepção de imigrantes de outros partidos na Alemanha. You can continue.
Thanks, Ina. Thanks.
The second aspect, but this is also in a way, I mean, not due to my research, what I say, but rather sort of anecdotal evidence. It was told to me by a friend who lives in a small town in West Germany, which is more which is more or less conservative as well. And again, in regions that are predominantly conservative in political terms, people are usually not very open to migrants. In this small town, everybody was welcoming to the Syrian refugees. And her idea was, my friend's idea who was living there, was that this is due to the fact that very many people in this small town have relatives who had to migrate from eastern parts of Germany to West Germany in the aftermath of Second World War. So almost every family there has relatives who had to migrate, and her interpretation was that because of this, and in a way the knowledge of personal family histories of migration and the experiences that were there led people to be much more welcoming than she would have expected.
A Ina disse que ela recebeu um ponto de vista interessante de um amigo dela que vive numa cidade pequena no oeste da Alemanha e que apresentou um ponto de vista interessante, que era o seguinte: as pessoas na Alemanha não são geralmente muito receptivas com imigrantes. Porém, nessa cidade pequena em questão, o amigo dela disse que as pessoas, os habitantes da cidade, eram muito receptivos. E o ponto de vista desse amigo da Ina foi que eles eram receptivos porque muitas das pessoas dessa cidade tinham parentes ou amigos que tiveram, após a Segunda Guerra Mundial, que migrar de uma parte da Alemanha para outra. E isso abriu um senso de empatia para eles, em que eles dão muito melhor as boas-vindas para imigrantes, nesse caso, sírios.
A próxima pergunta vem da Ethel. Ela indaga por que o governo alemão ainda apoia a atitude de Israel em relação ao povo da Palestina.
So another question comes from Ethel. She asks, why the German government still support the attitude of Israel toward the Palestinian people?
That's a politically supercharged question, and of course it's an interesting one. And I'm not sure whether I'm the right person to answer it, but what is happening is that Germany, the government, is taking into account that the history of Israel is closely connected to European anti-Semitism and particularly to the Shoah, the Holocaust. And therefore, there is a particular responsibility for the well-being of Jewish people that is seen as a rationale of the government. Of course, there are very many people who say that the government of Israel at the moment in its acts towards in its way it treats Palestinian people, that this is something that also must be problematized. In the public discourse, this is problematized as well in Germany, and Germany is also supporting development initiatives and humanitarian initiatives in Palestine. So it's a very, very complicated and complex situation, but the particular connection between, or I would say that in a way a particular responsibility due to German history, the Second World War and particularly the Holocaust history is playing a big role in the way in which the German government is relating to the state of Israel.
A Ina, obviamente, considera essa uma pergunta muito complicada politicamente, mas o que ela acredita é que o governo alemão sente uma forte sensação de responsabilidade com a causa de Israel, por causa que é muito mais ligada com o passado nazista europeu, principalmente com o passado alemão. Então, isso desperta um grande senso de responsabilidade, o que não quer dizer que o governo da Alemanha também não apoie causas humanitárias e de ajuda ao povo palestino, mas ela considera que a questão da responsabilidade do governo alemão para com a causa judaica, no caso Israel, é muito mais forte e tem um papel muito mais forte nessa questão.
Passamos para a pergunta do professor Marco. Confundir ou promover a confusão entre a experiência nazista e a experiência comunista na Alemanha, apesar das evidências históricas, interessa a quem na sociedade alemã?
So this question comes from Tatal Marcos, and he asks, to whom in German society interests either to confuse or to promote the confusion between the Nazi experience and communism experience in Germany, besides historical evidences?
That's not so. That's also a really, really complicated question, because I mean you refer to also history outside of Germany, right? Say the Eastern Bloc sort of history. And let me think. I mean, there has been a very, very long debate, and usually it's I don't know if I can answer this actually. Let me think, because there is something in my head in German. I have to translate it into English, and then to think about what I say. I'm not so sure what to say, to be honest. But I guess one would have to ask historians. I'm not a historian, about what happened when the GDR was in a way classified as a dictatorship, right? Which was basically the classification of the Nazi regime as well. And it would be interesting to study, and probably colleagues have done this, and I'm not aware of it, sort of how exactly it came into being, the particular treatment of the GDR past after in the 90s. And the fact that the rather retributive regime was installed right away. So I guess one should ask the historians if this is the aspects that you refer to. I mean, there are all sorts of people who have make all sorts of comparisons also, and I would have to think a bit to figure out what to answer if I was to answer in a more general way, and regarding other phenomena as well. Sorry for not being able to be clearer on this one.
A Ina considera essa pergunta muito complicada porque ela não é uma historiadora, e o que ela considera é que seria necessário perguntar aos historiadores algumas coisas para responder essa pergunta muito melhor. Ela acha que é necessário perguntar aos historiadores qual foi a classificação de fato do governo nazista, como ele foi considerado uma ditadura, em que momento, e tem muitas comparações que são possíveis de fazer, então ela gostaria de talvez estudar um pouco mais sobre isso, e também acha que ela não é a pessoa adequada para responder essa pergunta.
But there's also been this legacy of speaking about the I mean before the 90s, of speaking about different forms of totalitarian systems, right? So this has been used also, to my knowledge, in the Cold War to, in a way, position Western democracies against the Eastern Bloc. And I guess one would have to look in more detail to different authors who were engaged in this debate to figure out what exactly their particular motives were. But sort of these theories of totalitarian systems, the German word is Totalitarismustheorie, that was there, and it has been used. And then, of course, I mean, there are authors like Hannah Arendt, who in her book on totalitarianism is, in a way, speaking about different forms of it in the course of history. But sort of the more political sort of usage in the German in West German's public sphere has been one that I guess should be qualified or could be qualified as anti-communist.
A Ina também falou agora um pouco, que é possível comparar. Houve um legado de falar das formas de totalitarismo muito antes dos anos 90, né? E esse discurso de falar sobre as formas de totalitarismo antes dos anos 90 foi usado na Guerra Fria para se opor ideologicamente à União Soviética, claro. Mas quais eram os motivos? É isso que ela disse que é preciso perguntar. Ela citou que a Hannah Arendt fala sobre as formas de totalitarismo na obra dela, claro, sobre as formas de totalitarismo, e que ela qualifica as formas de totalitarismo, mas é preciso se perguntar qual é o motivo desse discurso e dessa conversa.
Passamos para a próxima pergunta. Ina, quando você cita Messerschmitt e diz que, infelizmente, ainda existem muitas provas empíricas de que o racismo não foi superado, não muito tempo atrás, o Bolsonaro tomou um copo de leite cru num pronunciamento oficial. Como você observa esse ato velado de um homem de Estado e como você observa que ele seria tratado na Alemanha hoje?
So, Ina, you quote Messerschmitt and said that, unfortunately, there's a lot of empirical evidence that proves to us that racism has not been overcome. Not long ago, Bolsonaro had a glass of raw milk in an official statement. So how do you observe this veiled act of statesman, and how do you think he would be treated in Germany today?
I don't know. But of course, downplaying racism, I always find problematic. And a lot of people do this, not only heads of state. Yeah. How Bolsonaro would be treated in Germany, no idea, to be honest. I'm glad that in the elections, the right-wing Nazi, the right-wing party hasn't won the majority, and yeah, but apart from this, you know, it's hard to say how he would be treated. Let's see whether he will be received or not by the government, and what the new government. And we are not have. I mean, you know, we had elections, and the parties are now in the process of forming a coalition. How the relations, official ones, will be, but apart from this, it's hard to guess. But there is critical discourse about Bolsonaro, of course, and this is part of a critical discourse on right-wing populism. But I must also say that, and this is, I would say, a problematic thing, that Brazil, I would say, to the German general public is not so much of interest as, for instance, the US. So there was much more reporting and debate and concern with regard to Donald Trump, for instance, than with regard to Bolsonaro.
Bom, a Ina disse, claro, que é uma pergunta problemática. Muita gente comete atos desse tipo, não só chefes de Estado, ela disse, mas ela não faz ideia de como Bolsonaro seria recebido na Alemanha. O partido alemão de direita agora não ganhou, a Alemanha está no processo de formar as coalizões para as eleições, o partido de direita não ganhou. O Bolsonaro seria recebido? Ela não sabe, acha que pelo novo governo, não. E também disse que lá na Alemanha há discurso crítico sobre Bolsonaro? Mas se falou muito mais sobre o Donald Trump, por exemplo, durante o governo dele, do que sobre o Bolsonaro.
A próxima pergunta é do Tatal. Ele diz: Rolândia, na década de 50, dos 900, recebeu da Alemanha uma série de presentes como forma de acomodação da memória da perseguição. A estátua de Roland é um exemplo. uma investigação histórica da cidade publicada em alemão e português, e o convite ao retorno à Europa com compensações monetárias, que não interessaram a maior parte daqueles que se estabeleceram aqui. Como você analisa esse desprezo, essa não vontade de retornar, apesar dos esforços governamentais?
This question comes from also Marco Tatal. Hollandia in the 1950s received a series of gifts from Germany as a way to accommodate the memory of the persecution. Hollandia statues as an example. So a historical research of the city published in German and Portuguese, and the invitation to return to Europe with monetary compensations that did not interest most of those who were settled here. How would you analyze this contempt, this willingness to return despite governmental efforts?
That's also a hard question. And of course, it's a very political one, but I am aware of the fact that I said also in my talk that this is a totally political topic. So there are no non-political answers. Well, I would imagine that there were history patriots, maybe, you know? And so if I understood the question correctly, so I mean, history is a contested thing, and there are always people who don't want to engage in a critical reflection on the past. I hope I understood the question correctly, but this is what I would say to what I understood.
A Ina considera essa uma pergunta difícil e totalmente política. Não há como não ser político para responder essa pergunta. E o que ela pensa é que a história é basicamente contexto nesse caso. E sempre vão haver pessoas que não querem fazer uma reflexão crítica sobre o passado. E é isso.
A próxima pergunta é da Laureci. Como o cidadão alemão se coloca frente à onda de imigração que vem ocorrendo na Europa e especialmente na Alemanha? Acho que
especially in German.
Sorry,
You have to repeat. Oh,
yeah,
she's frozen.
Someone, maybe, I don't know whether it was my connection. I heard the question.
No, I think it's Mariana's connection. But the question is, how does a German citizen nowadays react to the wave of immigrants that come into Germany today?
Well, I don't know if there's a wave of immigrants coming, but the citizenry of the country is very heterogeneous, you know. It's not people are having very different positions, and there are huge demonstrations in favor of open borders and people who try to help people to get out of Afghanistan, for instance. But there's also people who find that problematic. So it's hard to generalize, you know. It's a heterogeneous society, and people have very different positions concerning migration, including migration of people who have to flee from their home country.
A Ina considera que não é possível generalizar a posição dos cidadãos alemães hoje em relação à imigração, porque as posições são muito variadas. Tem pessoas que tentam trazer pessoas, por exemplo, do Afeganistão, que está vivendo uma situação de muita imigração no momento, e tem pessoas que são muito críticas a isso e tentam não deixar os imigrantes entrarem. Então, é uma situação em que não se pode generalizar o posicionamento da população alemã.
Bom, Bom, nós estamos na última pergunta. Se caso algum das pessoas que estão assistindo tiver ou quiser fazer uma outra pergunta, por favor, peço que passe agora para que nós possamos traduzir e passar para a Ina. Por enquanto, a última pergunta fica sendo a da Giovana. Ela pergunta: no Brasil, nós estamos vivenciando uma série de negacionismo em relação ao nazismo, sendo que representantes do governo brasileiro promovem discursos de ódio às minorias sociais e se utilizam de símbolos e discursos nazistas para disseminar o ódio contra esses grupos. Como você percebe as várias tentativas de negar o nazismo e as tentativas do governo alemão em intermediar essa situação?
This question comes from Giovanna, and she asks, here in Brazil, we are experiencing a series of denials about Nazism. So since the Brazilian government are promoting hate speeches against social minorities and using Nazi symbols and speeches to spread hate against these groups. So how do you perceive these many denying Nazism and the German government's actions to mediate this situation?
Well, of course, I find the denial of Nazism whenever it happens, wherever it happens, problematic. I'm not so sure whether it's the main responsibility of the German government. I'm not sure whether Germany is doing anything sort of. I mean, I'm actually not. I'm not so aware of sort of German politics in Brazil, but probably it would be considered an internal kind of thing, and they wouldn't, you know. So it's. I would say that it's rather a that something like this happening is rather a. If I would want to attribute a responsibility, it would be rather the Brazilian and the, say, international civil society or so, and not any particular government. Even though, of course, I guess, and this is thought experimenting, one could maybe attribute a particular responsibility to even the German, to the German government to take issue with Nazism happening anywhere, but I don't think that this is a responsibility that the government necessarily takes on. But one would have to look closer into particular things that, for instance, party foundations are doing, and there's a lot of money being spent on all sorts of initiatives, and maybe there is something against Nazi tendencies in Brazil, even that the German government is funding, but still it's maybe, yeah. I guess this is what I can say. I would not necessarily, even though I'm not against the state as an institution at all. There are some problems that I would not, in the first place, call for governments to solve them, but rather sometimes civil societies or civil society initiatives and organizations to work together. And then, of course, government money is something that might help to fund particular initiatives, but that's not necessarily the only source that can help.
Thanks, Ina. Bom, a Ina considera, claro, que o negacionismo é problemático, claro, mas ela não sabe se a responsabilidade por esses atos é de qualquer governo. Ela considera que seria da sociedade civil a responsabilidade, e nesse caso também não é da responsabilidade do governo da Alemanha. No caso de atos negacionistas ao nazismo no Brasil, também não cabe à Alemanha. Ela também considera que a culpa, a responsabilidade seria da sociedade civil brasileira. Uma coisa assim como uma responsabilidade não é de um governo, é da população. Tem dinheiro sendo gasto pelo governo alemão para combater esse tipo de coisa. O governo alemão financia esse tipo de iniciativa, mas ela ainda não daria isso para o governo resolver, e sim para organizações civis, com parceria de dinheiro do governo.
A última pergunta, eu acredito que seja a última pergunta. Se caso alguém mais quiser fazer alguma indagação, fique à vontade. mas por enquanto a última pergunta é do professor Lucas, e ele disse que recentemente o julgamento de uma secretária de um campo de concentração gerou uma série de questionamentos na mídia populista alemã, a mídia que vai pelo nome de Bild, sobre a necessidade de tais ações. Isso reflete uma permanência de um pensamento fascista latente na sociedade alemã, e as acusações da esquerda alemã de que o Estado nunca se livrou efetivamente do fascismo são legítimas?
This is the last question. It comes from Lucas, and he asks, recently the trial of a concentration camp secretary generated a series of questions in the German populist medium, the BILD, so about the necessity of such actions. So does this reflect the permanence of latent fascist thinking in German society? And are the accusations by the German left that the state has never effectively rid itself of fascism legitimate?
Thank you. Well, I would say that the left is constantly problematizing and criticizing acts of Nazism, and society has changed tremendously in this respect, I would say. Maybe not because the state wanted to do it, but due to collaborative efforts. And I'm speaking for West Germany now. First of all, re-education measures and sort of democratization policies in the 40s and 50s, and then particularly the 68 movement, which was a movement basically of young people who in a way asked their parents what they had been doing, or their grandparents, during the Nazi period. So that has set a democratization process has set off a democratization process. This Bild-Zeitung, this newspaper that you just quoted, is a tabloid, and they are, in a way, it's a populist paper in very many respects. So I would say in the liberal and in the left discourse, this is not a paper that is being taken seriously intellectually, because it's sort of the populist press. And it has a very large reach, and but to be honest, if I remember the reporting on this event, it wasn't a huge thing in the German media for weeks or so. It came and it passed. At least this is what I got of it. So I wouldn't consider it as one of the most striking or strongest sort of objects of public debate in the field of memory politics. There is right now a huge debate going on actually on the relationship of Nazi past and Holocaust memorial and colonial memorial, and there is a big debate going on the way in which Germany deals with its colonial past. And I can say one more sentence to this after you translate it, in case you want to. Otherwise, I continue. Just give me a sign. Should I stop?
Yes, may I? Just because so I can translate you fully. So. A Ina disse que a esquerda alemã constantemente problematiza atos de nazismo, claro. A sociedade alemã mudou muito ultimamente por causa de esforços colaborativos no sentido da educação e principalmente por causa do movimento de 1968, que foi basicamente um movimento de pessoas jovens que questionaram o comportamento das pessoas mais velhas, seus pais e seus avós, o que eles estavam fazendo durante o nazismo. Esse tipo de movimento colaborativo da população ajudou muito no processo de democratização da Alemanha e na mudança de mentalidade em relação ao passado nazista. Esse jornal que a pessoa que fez a pergunta mencionou é um tabloide popular, a Ina disse. Ele não é levado muito a sério na Alemanha no sentido intelectual, é uma imprensa popular de alto alcance, mas é mais um veículo de massas, não é muito levado a sério. Ela lembra quando saiu isso no jornal, não foi algo grande na Alemanha, não foi discutido por mais do que umas semanas e depois passou, pelo que ela lembra. Ela não considerou muito impactante. Há um debate agora na Alemanha, sim, sobre a relação entre o passado nazista da Alemanha e a memória colonial da Alemanha e como a Alemanha está lidando com essa memória colonial do seu passado. Mas a Ina vai continuar a responder. You can continue.
So I would say there is two or several huge debates at the moment. One is concerning the objects in ethnographic collections, particularly in Berlin right now, because a huge new museum opened in the Humboldt, so-called Humboldt Forum, which is a museum on the main street in Berlin, which is a reconstruction of the former palace. The front of it is, and some of the sides of it are as well. And then there are parts of the architecture which are modern. But basically the front, the facade is a reconstruction of this old building, which is criticized by many as a case of history revisionism, and inside the ethnographic collection is exhibited, and there has been huge debates in the last years, and they're ongoing, on how the objects in this collection came to Germany, because lots of them were robbed, and lots of them were robbed in connection with murder and other atrocities. So it's not an innocent collection. It's not an innocent collection without actually quotation marks. It's not an innocent collection at all. So there is a huge debate on this going on at the moment. There is lots of studies being done concerning the provenance of the objects in the museums. And there are critics who say, we can study forever, we should restitute actually lots of the objects in these museums. And there are museums in several countries, particularly African countries, but not only African countries, who actually ask for objects to be restituted. There are human remains in German collections, and there is debate and debate in civil society, but also on government level about the restitution of human remains, like skulls that in the course of German colonialism in Africa were anyway just taken away, sometimes making relatives of those who had been killed to clean the skulls from the rest of the corpses. And so this is one debate. And then I can say one more sentence about another debate, but I let you translate first.
Thanks, Ina. Então. Há vários debates muito grandes acontecendo agora na Alemanha com essa relação, né? Um dos debates agora que a Ina citou considera as coleções etnográficas nos museus da Alemanha, que é um debate muito interessante. Ela diz: um novo museu foi inaugurado em Berlim, é o Museu de Humboldt, se eu não me engano. Não sei se eu entendi direito. A fachada desse prédio reconstitui uma construção antiga. E a crítica é que esse tipo de arquitetura que reconstitui esse tipo de arquitetura antiga é um revisionismo histórico, e esse museu está sendo muito criticado, assim como outros museus na Alemanha, pela questão da procedência da coleção etnográfica. Como os objetos que estão dentro desse museu foram parar ali? Eles foram roubados, isso é um fato, não é uma coleção inocente, a Ina diz nessas palavras. Tem muitos estudos sobre isso atualmente. Tem países, principalmente no continente africano, que pedem os objetos de volta, e tem até restos mortais de pessoas desses países que estão nesses museus. Os países pedem os objetos e os restos mortais de volta. Isso é um debate, e a Ina vai falar sobre mais um. You can continue, Ina.
And then there's another debate on basically what is anti-Semitism and what is not anti-Semitism, particularly with regard to the critique of Israel and with regard to BDS, this, say, international action which is calling for basically not cooperating with Israel or Israeli institutions, and sometimes, yeah. And so Germany has officially said that BDS is BDS is anti-Semitic, and that full stop. And so there has been a huge debate on different people and different organizations who were put into connection with BDS. And one of those, and there's been huge uproar about this, which is, yeah. So one of the people who has been accused and being criticized severely in connection with this has been Achille Mbembe, the political theorist and historian and critic of the legacies of colonial racism, particularly, who had a very prominent role in the German public sphere for a while after the publication of the German translation of his book, Critique of Black Reason. And for some reasons, well, he had been invited to give an opening lecture of an important art event, and then he had been uninvited. In the end, the lecture wasn't given because of COVID, but there's been huge debate on Achille Mbembe and on anti-Semitism. And what is interesting about this debate, even though I also have serious reservations regarding the debate, and is that maybe it is a case of what Rothberg problematizes. It is a case in which someone who had criticized colonial racism and the after effects of that was accused of anti-Semitism, and in a way, by those who have posed this criticism, I wouldn't say silenced, but in a way his importance in the German discourse was diminished. And those people who problematized Mbembe didn't problematize necessarily in the same way in real anti-Semites, real anti-Semites, but particularly this intellectual from an African country who was criticizing racism in Europe, racism that is connected to colonialism. So in a way, one could say that in this debate, anti-Semitism and colonial racism were played out against each other in a probably not very fruitful way. So this has been a debate which was huge. I was sometimes wondering why it was so huge, and sort of my self-made explanation is that the newspapers, that in COVID and in lockdown, journalists had problems filling the pages, in the cultural sections of the papers where usually people were writing about plays and cinema events and all sorts of things that weren't taking place right now. They had to fill the pages. So this debate came in handy maybe, but it's ongoing. And Rothberg's book has been translated into German, and that came out recently. So there is, in a way, events and publications nurturing this debate. It's been going on for, say, a year and a half right now. And I would say that these debates are much more prominent than the one one of the people who posed the question referred to this case of this Bild-Zeitungs case, or the case of this former concentration camp worker.
Thanks, Ina. A Ina, então, agora citou um segundo debate que está acontecendo na Alemanha, que é o debate sobre o que é e o que não é antissemitismo na Alemanha. E esse debate envolve muito Israel e uma organização internacional que ela usou a sigla BDS. Eu não sei o que quer dizer a sigla. A Alemanha começou a acusar essa organização de ser antissemita, o governo alemão, e acusou todas as pessoas que eram envolvidas ou associadas com essa organização de alguma forma de serem antissemitas. E um famoso historiador, que eu também não entendi o nome porque é em alemão, acho que o sobrenome dele é Bember, foi acusado de ser associado com essa organização, e por isso várias palestras dele que ele estava pronto para dar, já estava marcado, foram canceladas, porque este historiador é um crítico do racismo colonial, que é um legado do colonialismo na Alemanha. Ele foi convidado, depois desconvidado, para palestrar por causa dessa associação que foi feita dele com essa organização internacional. E o que acontece é que muita gente na Alemanha que fala sobre racismo colonial está sendo associada ao antissemitismo. Virou um debate muito grande entre antissemitismo e racismo colonial, ambos sendo colocados nessa discussão e se chocando. Ela disse que essa discussão durou muito, já dura ver sobre isso, e já faz 1 ano e meio que está rolando. E ela considera que esse debate é muito mais legal do que esse outro debate que foi citado, que saiu no tabloide lá alemão. Ela acha que isso é mais interessante.
Ok, finalizamos com as perguntas. Não recebemos mais perguntas nenhuma. A gente vai encerrar agora por 1 minutinho para voltar com as falas finais. Agradeço já de antemão a presença de vocês e peço para que aguardem mais um pouco para que nós encerremos completamente.
I must thank Ina for the brilliant lesson that she gave us today. Thank you very much, Ina. I hope she enjoyed it and had fun. Now let her joy on Yati. E agradecemos também ao público que nos prestigiou ao longo deste ano. Foram longos meses de encontros discutindo aspectos teóricos e práticos sobre o norte do Paraná. Então, eu agradeço a todos que participaram das nossas atividades e antecipo que estamos preparando para o ano que vem um outro ciclo de palestras que também vai se dedicar aí a discutir aspectos do norte do Paraná.
And I would also like to thank everyone, particularly Tatao and the translators and the entire team who organized this event tonight, but also the other events and the entire series. I'm really, really happy that several of the students of Koblenz were part of it, besides my own participation, and that this university connection that we set up, even though during COVID it was hard to in a way, make things happen concerning it in terms of travel, that this collaboration went on in this format. So muito, muito, muito obrigada. It was a very interesting discussion for me tonight, because to me it was a very general one. It wasn't so easy to answer always, and I hope that what I could contribute was helpful in some way. Also maybe to understanding the situation of Hollandia. And I think that there is a lot that can be sort of done in terms of research there. And I wish everyone who is doing this right now much joy doing so. And hopefully at some point I might take part myself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Beijos.
Pessoal, a Ina agradeceu muito a presença de todos. Agradeceu todo mundo aqui, principalmente ao Tatao, ela disse. Agradeceu aos tradutores, Mariana, Estênio. Ficou muito feliz que teve alunos da Koblenz que participaram. Estava triste por causa do Covid, mas ficou feliz que mesmo assim foi possível fazer o evento e que a discussão para ela foi muito legal porque foi difícil e fez ela refletir muito. Algumas coisas ela não sabia como responder e ela teve que pensar. E ficou muito contente com a discussão sobre Rolândia. Ela disse que ainda há muito a pesquisar lá e ela mal pode esperar.